The screech of tires still echoed in Emma's mind, though 3 months had passed since that terrible night. She sat in the corner of her new bedroom at the county children's home, knees pulled tight against her chest, her lips pressed into a thin line. The other children played loudly in the common room downstairs, their laughter floating up through the floorboards like ghosts of a life she used to know. But Emma hadn't spoken a single word since the accident. Not when the paramedics pulled her from the wreckage. Not when the doctors examined her. Not when the social workers asked her gentle questions. The words were locked somewhere deep inside her, buried beneath the weight of what she had witnessed. It had been raining that night, the kind of heavy downpour that turns roads into rivers. Emma's father was driving carefully, both hands on the wheel, while her mother sang along softly to the radio. Emma remembered feeling safe in the back seat, watching the raindrops race across her window. Then came the blinding headlights. Her father shouted. Her mother screamed. The world spun violently, glass shattering like 1,000 tiny stars exploding around her. When everything finally stopped moving, Emma was hanging upside down, held by her seatbelt. She could see her father slumped over the steering wheel. Her mother's head rested at an odd angle against the shattered window. Emma tried to call out to them, but no sound came. She tried again and again, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water, but her voice had simply vanished. The doctors called it selective mutism, a psychological response to severe trauma. They assured her foster families that with time and therapy, she would speak again. But Emma had been through 3 foster homes already. The first family had 7 other children and barely noticed when she arrived or when she left. The second family grew frustrated with her silence, treating it as defiance rather than pain. The third family simply couldn't handle a child who wouldn't respond, who wouldn't participate, who seemed like a ghost haunting their happy home. Now she was back at the children's home, waiting for someone else to try and fail to reach her. Mrs. Henderson, the home's director, was a kind woman with gray hair and soft eyes that crinkled when she smiled. She never pushed Emma to talk, never treated her silence as a problem to be solved. Instead, she would sit beside Emma during meals, offering food without expecting conversation. She would read stories aloud in the evening, not waiting for responses, just sharing words the way one might share warmth from a fire. But even Mrs. Henderson's patience was wearing thin. Emma could see it in the worried glances, the hushed phone conversations with social services, the stack of files on her desk labeled with Emma's name. On a cold November morning, Mrs. Henderson sat down beside Emma in the common room. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, coating the world in white silence. Mrs. Henderson held a folder in her hands, and Emma knew without being told that another placement had been found. Another family. Another attempt. Another inevitable failure. Mrs. Henderson opened the folder slowly, as if giving Emma time to prepare herself. But instead of showing Emma a picture of a smiling couple or a cheerful family portrait, she revealed something different. It was a photograph of a small cabin nestled in the mountains, smoke curling from its chimney, surrounded by towering pine trees heavy with snow. Beside the cabin stood a man, tall and weathered, with a thick gray beard and eyes that seemed to hold their own kind of sadness. His name is Thomas McAllister, Mrs. Henderson said gently. He's not looking to adopt, Emma. He's just offering a place for the winter. He lives alone in the mountains, works an old mining claim. He said he has room for someone who needs quiet. She paused, studying Emma's face. I know you've been moved around too much. I know you're tired. But something tells me this might be different. He's not expecting you to be anything other than who you are right now. Emma looked at the photograph, at the lonely cabin in the woods, at the man who seemed as isolated from the world as she felt. For the first time in months, something stirred inside her. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the smallest possibility that being alone together might be less lonely than being alone in a crowd. She nodded once, slowly, and Mrs. Henderson squeezed her hand. The truck climbed higher into the mountains, the road growing narrower with each passing mile. Thomas McAllister drove in silence, his large hands steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the winding path ahead. Emma sat in the passenger seat, her small backpack clutched on her lap, watching the world transform around her. The bare trees of the valley gave way to thick evergreens, their branches heavy with snow. The air grew colder, sharper, cleaner somehow. When they finally pulled up to the cabin she had seen in the photograph, it looked even smaller than she had imagined, a tiny island of warmth in an ocean of white wilderness. Thomas cut the engine and sat for a moment before speaking. His voice was deep and rough, like gravel rolling down a mountainside. I'm not good with words, Emma. Never have been. I live a simple life up here. I work my mind during the day, come home at night, and mostly keep to myself. I won't push you to talk or be someone you're not. You just need to follow a few rules. Stay warm, eat your meals, and don't wander into the mine. It's dangerous down there. He climbed out of the truck without waiting for a response, and Emma followed, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A wood stove glowed in the corner, filling the single room with welcome heat. There was a small kitchen area with a hand pump for water, a table with 2 chairs, and 2 narrow beds on opposite sides of the room. Shelves lined one wall, filled with canned goods, books with worn spines, and a few personal items that hinted at a life Emma knew nothing about. Thomas showed her which bed was hers, where to find extra blankets, and how to work the stove. His movements were efficient, practical, without unnecessary conversation. Emma appreciated this. She was tired of people trying to coax words out of her with endless questions and concerned expressions. That first night, they ate dinner in silence. Thomas had made a simple stew, thick with vegetables and meat, and fresh bread that surprised Emma with its softness. He ate methodically, occasionally glancing at her to make sure she was eating too, but never staring, never making her feel observed. After dinner, he washed the dishes while Emma sat by the stove, warming her hands. When the work was done, Thomas pulled out a harmonica from his pocket and began to play. The music was slow and melancholy, notes that seemed to capture the loneliness of the mountains themselves. Emma closed her eyes and listened, feeling something in her chest loosen just slightly. The days fell into a rhythm. Thomas would wake before dawn, eat a quick breakfast, and head to his mine about a quarter-mile from the cabin. Emma could see the entrance from the kitchen window, a dark opening in the mountainside framed by wooden supports. He had warned her away from it, and she had no intention of disobeying. Instead, she spent her days exploring the area around the cabin, always keeping it in sight. She discovered a frozen stream that bubbled beneath its icy surface. She found animal tracks in the snow and tried to identify them from a wildlife book she found on Thomas's shelf. She watched birds brave enough to face the winter, their small bodies puffed against the cold. In the evenings, Thomas would return, covered in dust and exhaustion. He would clean up, cook dinner, and then they would sit by the fire. Sometimes he played his harmonica. Sometimes he read aloud from his books, adventure stories and old westerns, never asking if she was interested, just sharing them the way Mrs. Henderson had done. Sometimes he simply sat and carved small figures from wood, his knife moving with surprising delicacy for such large hands. Emma found herself watching him work, fascinated by the way his rough exterior hid such careful artistry. He carved animals mostly, deer and bears and wolves, each one unique and expressive. One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Thomas set down his carving and looked at her directly. "I had a daughter once," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Her name was Sarah. She'd be about your age now." He paused, his jaw working as if chewing on words too difficult to swallow. "She died when she was 5. Cancer. My wife, she couldn't bear it. Left me the year after. Said the mountains reminded her too much of what we'd lost." He picked up his carving again, not looking at Emma. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I understand what it's like when words don't seem big enough to hold what you're feeling. Sometimes silence is the only honest response to pain." Emma felt tears sting her eyes. She wanted to reach out to him, to somehow let him know she understood, but she couldn't move. Thomas continued carving as if he hadn't just opened an old wound, and Emma realized he wasn't asking for comfort. He was simply offering truth in exchange for truth, silence in solidarity with silence. Winter deepened its grip on the mountains, and with it came a bitter cold that made the world outside the cabin feel hostile and unforgiving. Emma had been with Thomas for nearly 6 weeks, and their silent companionship had settled into something comfortable. She had stopped flinching when he moved suddenly. She had started helping with small tasks, setting the table for meals, gathering kindling from the woodpile, even attempting to help with the dishes. Thomas never commented on these contributions, but she noticed he had carved a small rabbit and left it on her pillow one evening, a quiet acknowledgement of her presence in his life. On a grey February morning, Thomas prepared for work as usual, but something was different. He moved more slowly, his face tight with concentration. He checked his equipment 3 times, something Emma had never seen him do before. At the door, he turned back to her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Storm's coming," he said. "A big one. I need to secure some supports in the mine before it hits, make sure nothing collapses under the weight of new snow. I'll be back before dark. If I'm not, you stay inside, keep the fire going, and don't come looking for me. Understand?" Emma nodded, but a cold feeling settled in her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. The morning passed slowly. Emma tried to occupy herself with her usual activities, but she kept returning to the window, watching the mine entrance. The sky grew darker as clouds rolled in like a grey army advancing across the mountains. By noon, the first snowflakes began to fall, light and delicate at first, then heavier, faster, until the world outside became a swirling white curtain. Emma could barely see the mine entrance anymore. She added wood to the stove and tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. Something felt wrong. The silence of the cabin, which had been comforting before, now felt oppressive and threatening. As afternoon faded toward evening, the storm intensified. Wind howled around the cabin, finding every crack and crevice to whistle through. Snow piled against the windows, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Thomas should have been home by now. Emma's heart began to pound. She paced the small cabin, going to the window again and again, seeing nothing but white chaos. She told herself he was just being careful, taking his time, waiting for a break in the storm. But as darkness fell and he still hadn't appeared, her fear crystallized into certainty. Something was wrong. She stood at the door, her hand on the latch, remembering Thomas's warning. "Don't come looking for me. Stay inside." But what if he was hurt? What if he needed help? She was just a child, and she couldn't speak, but she was here, and there was no one else. Emma pulled on every piece of warm clothing she could find, wrapping herself in layers like armor against the storm. She lit a lantern Thomas kept by the door, tested its flame against the wind, and stepped outside. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The wind tore at her clothes and tried to rip the lantern from her hand. She could barely see 5 feet in front of her, but she knew the direction of the mine. She had looked at it from the window every day. She trudged forward, the snow already knee-deep, fighting for every step. The world had vanished, reduced to the small circle of lantern light and the roar of wind. More than once, she nearly turned back, terror clawing at her throat. But each time, she thought of Thomas sitting alone in that cabin, carving his small animals, carrying his own silent grief. He had given her space to heal. Now she would do whatever she could to help him. When she finally reached the mine entrance, she saw why Thomas hadn't returned. A section of the support structure had collapsed, and snow had piled against the opening, partially blocking it. In the dim light of her lantern, she could see drag marks in the snow inside the entrance, as if something or someone had been pulled deeper into the darkness. She called out, but of course, no sound came. She was still voiceless, still locked in her silent prison. Panic rose in her chest. She could see boot prints leading into the mine, but they didn't come back out. Thomas was in there, somewhere in the darkness, possibly trapped, possibly injured. Emma stood at the threshold, the lantern shaking in her hand. Thomas had warned her never to enter the mine. It was dangerous, unstable, a place where death waited in the dark. But what choice did she have? She couldn't run back to the cabin and wait. She couldn't call for help. She was 8 years old and couldn't speak, but she was all Thomas had. Emma took a deep breath of the freezing air and stepped into the mine. The darkness swallowed her immediately. Her lantern pushed back against it, creating a small sphere of light that revealed rough stone walls, support beams, and the narrow path leading downward. The air smelled of damp earth and something metallic. She could hear water dripping somewhere deeper in the tunnel. She moved carefully, testing each step, terrified the ground would give way beneath her. The boot prints continued ahead, clear in the dust. She followed them like a lifeline, her lantern held high. The tunnel branched several times, but the prints always showed which way Thomas had gone. Minutes felt like hours as she descended deeper into the mountain. Then she heard it, a faint groan, unmistakably human, somewhere ahead in the darkness. Emma's heart leaped. He was alive. She moved faster now, reckless with relief, and almost missed the place where the floor dropped away. She caught herself at the last second, her lantern swinging wildly, revealing a shaft that plunged into blackness. And there, about 15 feet down, lying on a ledge of rock, was Thomas. Thomas lay motionless on the narrow ledge, his body twisted at an angle that made Emma's stomach clench with fear. His lantern had fallen with him and lay shattered below, its oil seeping into the stone. Blood darkened the side of his head where he must have struck the rock during his fall. Emma's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped her own lantern into the shaft. She knelt at the edge, holding the light over the drop, trying to see if he was breathing. For several terrifying seconds, she saw nothing. Then his chest rose slightly, fell, rose again. He was alive, but unconscious and badly hurt. Emma looked around frantically for something, anything that could help. The mine shaft was narrow, maybe 6 feet across, with rough walls that offered no easy way down. A rope hung from one of the support beams nearby, probably left by Thomas for securing equipment, but it was old and frayed in places. She tested it with her weight, and it held, but would it support her all the way down? And even if she reached him, what then? She couldn't carry him. She couldn't even call out if something went wrong. The full weight of her helplessness crashed over her. She was 8 years old, alone in a collapsing mine during a blizzard, trying to save a grown man who was trapped in a shaft. It was impossible. Thomas groaned again, and Emma saw his hand move slightly. He was waking up. She had to do something, had to let him know she was there. She grabbed a small stone and dropped it carefully near his head. It clattered against the rock, and Thomas's eyes fluttered open. He stared up at the darkness for a moment, confused, then his gaze found the light of Emma's lantern. His eyes widened in horror when he recognized her small face peering down at him. His mouth opened, and his voice came out rough and pained. "Emma, no. Get out of here. The mine is unstable. You have to go back, get yourself to safety." But Emma didn't move. She couldn't leave him. She wouldn't. Thomas tried to shift his position and gasped in pain, his face going white. His leg was clearly broken, possibly his ribs too. He wasn't going to climb out on his own, and there was no one else coming. The storm would last all night, maybe longer. By the time anyone thought to look for them, it might be too late. Emma looked at the rope again, made her decision, and began tying it around her waist. Thomas saw what she was doing and tried to shout, but his voice broke into a cough that left him gasping. "Please, Emma, just go. I'm not worth dying for." But he was wrong. Emma looped the rope around one of the support beams, testing the knot 3 times the way she had seen Thomas test everything. She positioned her lantern at the edge of the shaft where its light would reach as far down as possible. Then, with her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs, she began to lower herself down. The rope bit into her hands even through her gloves. The walls were slick with moisture and offered little purchase for her feet. She slipped once, swinging wildly in the darkness, but managed to catch herself against the wall. Thomas was saying something, but she couldn't focus on his words. She had to concentrate on each handhold, each foot placement, each breath that kept the panic at bay. After what felt like an eternity, her feet touched the ledge beside Thomas. It was barely wide enough for both of them, and she pressed herself against the wall to keep from falling off. Thomas looked at her with an expression of such anguish and gratitude mixed together that it hurt to see. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered, but his hand reached out and gripped hers with surprising strength. Emma examined him as best she could in the dim light. The head wound was bleeding but not gushing. His leg was definitely broken, the angle all wrong. He winced with every breath, suggesting injured ribs. He needed a hospital, but first they needed to get out of this shaft. Emma looked up at the rope hanging above them. There was no way Thomas could climb it in his condition. She couldn't pull him up, she wasn't strong enough. They were trapped together now, her heroic gesture amounting to nothing more than sharing his fate. Despair washed over her, cold and complete. She had failed. They would both die down here in the dark, and no one would find them until spring. Thomas seemed to read her thoughts. "Listen to me, Emma," he said, his voice fighting through pain. "You can still get out. Climb back up. The rope will hold you. Get to the cabin, wait out the storm, then follow the road down to town. Tell them where I am." Emma shook her head violently. Tell them? She couldn't tell anyone anything. She was voiceless, broken, useless. Tears streamed down her face, hot against the cold stone. Thomas squeezed her hand harder. "Then you have to find your voice, Emma. I know it's buried in there somewhere. I know it hurts to let it out. But sometimes the people we love are worth more than our pain." His words hit her like a physical blow. The people we love. Did he love her? This gruff, lonely miner who had taken in a broken child and asked nothing in return? And did she love him? This quiet man who understood silence because he lived in it too? The answer was obvious. It had been obvious for weeks. Somewhere in the quiet evenings by the fire, in the small carved animals left as gifts, in the shared grief neither could speak about, they had become family. Emma felt something crack inside her chest, like ice breaking on a frozen river. She opened her mouth, and for the first time in 3 months, she pushed against the wall of silence that had imprisoned her. At first, nothing came. Then a small sound, barely more than a breath. Then a word, cracked and rough and beautiful. "Help." Her own voice shocked her. Thomas's eyes went wide. Emma tried again, louder this time. "Help. Someone help us." Her voice echoed up the shaft, through the tunnels, weak and small but undeniably real. Thomas laughed, a sound mixed with crying and pain and joy. Emma's voice, unused for so long, scraped her throat raw, but she kept calling out. Help. Please. We're down here. The words felt foreign in her mouth, like she was speaking a language she had almost forgotten. Thomas watched her with tears streaming down his weathered face, one hand still gripping hers. That's it, sweetheart, he encouraged, his voice weak but steady. Keep calling. You found your voice again. Don't let it go. But even as Emma shouted until her throat burned, she knew the truth. No one was out there. The storm raged above, and they were alone in the depths of the mountain. Her voice finally gave out, reduced to a whisper. She slumped against the cold stone wall beside Thomas, exhaustion and hopelessness settling over them both like a heavy blanket. The lantern above was beginning to fade, its oil running low. Soon they would be in complete darkness. Thomas seemed to sense her despair. Emma, he said softly, I need you to listen carefully. You can still climb out. I need you to try. The rope is good enough for your weight. Get back to the cabin, wait until the storm passes, then walk down to Miller's Junction. It's about 5 miles following the road. Tell them about me. Emma shook her head stubbornly. No, she croaked, her new voice still rough and uncertain. I won't leave you. The words felt powerful, a declaration of loyalty that she had been unable to express for months. Thomas smiled sadly. You're brave, Emma. Braver than I ever was. When Sarah died, I ran away to these mountains. I've been hiding up here for 8 years, too afraid to face the world and all its pain. But you walked into a collapsed mine in a blizzard to save someone. You found your voice again when you needed it most. Don't waste that courage by dying down here with me. His words struck deep, but Emma's resolve held firm. She wasn't leaving him. Instead, she turned her attention to the problem at hand. There had to be a way out, some solution she was missing. She examined the shaft walls carefully in the fading light. The rock face was rough and uneven, with cracks and protrusions that might serve as hand and footholds. An idea began to form in her mind, desperate and dangerous, but possible. If she couldn't pull Thomas up with the rope alone, maybe she could use the rope to secure him while she went for help, but do it in a way that kept him from falling further if the ledge gave way. She explained her plan in halting words. She would tie the rope around Thomas's chest, then climb up and secure it to the strongest support beam she could find. Then she would go for help, knowing he wouldn't fall even if the ledge collapsed. Thomas started to protest, but Emma cut him off. You told me not to waste my courage, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. This is me being brave. Before he could argue further, she was moving. She untied the rope from her own waist and carefully wrapped it around Thomas's torso, under his arms. She made the knots as tight as she dared without hurting him, checking them 3 times just as he had taught her through observation. The climb back up was even harder than coming down. Her muscles screamed with exhaustion, and the cold had seeped into her bones. Twice she slipped, dangling by her fingertips over the darkness, but each time she found her grip and continued. When she finally pulled herself over the edge of the shaft, she lay gasping on the tunnel floor for precious seconds before forcing herself up. She grabbed the rope and pulled with all her strength, taking up the slack, then wrapped it around the thickest support beam multiple times before tying it off. Thomas was secured now, held by the mountain itself. Emma retrieved her lantern and began the journey back toward the entrance. The tunnel seemed longer than before, full of shadows that danced in her failing light. She heard creaking sounds from the support beams, and small showers of dirt fell from the ceiling. The mine was dying, slowly collapsing under the weight of winter. She moved faster, ignoring her exhaustion, driven by the knowledge that Thomas was counting on her. When she finally emerged from the mine entrance, the storm hit her with renewed fury. The world was white chaos, and the cabin had vanished behind curtains of snow. But Emma had walked this path dozens of times over the past weeks. She knew the way by feel as much as sight. Step by painful step, she fought through the storm. Her lantern died halfway to the cabin, but she kept moving, using the slope of the ground and the direction of the wind to guide her. When she finally saw the dark shape of the cabin materialize from the white, she nearly sobbed with relief. Inside, the fire had burned down to embers, and the room was bitterly cold. Emma's hands were so numb she could barely move her fingers, but she forced herself to rebuild the fire, to warm herself enough to continue. She found Thomas's supply of emergency flares, the bright red tubes he kept for signaling in emergencies. She had watched him demonstrate them once, explaining they were for calling for help if he ever got trapped in bad weather. Emma bundled herself in every warm thing she could find, grabbed the box of flares, and headed back out into the storm. The road down the mountain was somewhere past the cabin, a path she had never walked but had seen from the windows. She found it by luck as much as judgment and began the long descent. The storm tried to push her back, the wind screaming like a living thing, but Emma pressed forward. Every 100 yards, she lit a flare and stuck it in the snow, a trail of red lights marking her path. The bright flames sputtered in the wind but held, creating beacons in the darkness. She walked for what felt like hours, her legs moving mechanically, her mind focused on nothing but the next step, the next flare. She had no idea how far she had come or how far she had to go. The cold was making her drowsy, and she knew that was dangerous, but she couldn't stop. Thomas was waiting. Finally, through the curtain of snow, she saw lights. Real lights, warm and steady. Buildings. The tiny settlement of Miller's Junction appeared like a miracle. Emma staggered toward the first house she reached and pounded on the door with fists she could no longer feel. The door opened, revealing a startled man in his 50s, his face transforming from annoyance to shock as he saw the small, snow-covered child swaying on his porch. "Please," Emma said, her voice barely a whisper but clearly audible. "Thomas McAllister. Mine shaft. Trapped. Need help now." Then her legs gave out, and the world went dark. She woke briefly in a warm room, wrapped in blankets, while urgent voices spoke around her. She tried to tell them more about Thomas, about exactly where he was, but gentle hands kept her still. "We know, child," someone said. "We're going for him now. You did good. You rest now." Emma let herself sink back into darkness, trusting that the adults would finish what she had started. She woke fully 2 days later in a hospital room, her hands and feet bandaged for frostbite, her throat sore but healing. Mrs. Henderson was there, tears streaming down her kind face. "He's alive, Emma," she said before Emma could even ask. "Thomas is alive. They brought him out of that mine shaft, and he's going to recover. His leg is badly broken, and he has a concussion and 3 cracked ribs, but is going to be fine. The doctors said he wouldn't have survived another night down there. You saved his life, sweet girl." Emma's own tears came then, hot and cleansing. Mrs. Henderson held her while she cried, great heaving sobs that released months of pent-up grief and pain. When the storm finally passed, Emma spoke for the first time about the accident that had taken her parents. She spoke about the guilt she felt for surviving when they didn't. She spoke about the fear that her voice had somehow caused the crash, an irrational child's logic that had kept her silent. Mrs. Henderson listened to it all, and when Emma was finished, she gently explained what Emma already knew deep down, that none of it was her fault, that voices and words could never cause such tragedy, that she was allowed to live and speak and be happy even though her parents were gone. 3 weeks later, when Thomas was well enough for visitors, Emma walked into his hospital room. He looked smaller in the hospital bed, his leg in a cast, his head still bandaged, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. "There's my brave girl," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Emma crossed the room and took his hand, the same way he had held hers in the shaft. "Can I come home?" she asked quietly. "To the cabin? With you?" Thomas's grip tightened on her hand. "I talked to Mrs. Henderson," he said. "If you want to stay, if you think you can be happy with a grumpy old miner in the mountains, then yes. You can come home. For as long as you want." Emma smiled, really smiled, for the first time since before the accident. "I want to stay," she said clearly. "I want to stay with you." Over the following months, the adoption papers were filed and approved. Thomas sold his mining claim and took a job in town as a carpenter, work that didn't require him to descend into dangerous darkness. They moved to a larger house in Miller's Junction, close enough to town for Emma to attend school and make friends, but still near the mountains they both loved. Thomas continued carving his small animals, but now Emma sat beside him, learning to shape the wood with her own hands. On the anniversary of the night Emma found her voice again, they hiked back up to the old cabin, which Thomas had kept as a retreat. They sat by the wood stove, and Thomas played his harmonica while Emma, now 9 and thriving, told him about her day at school. The silence they had once shared had transformed into something richer, a comfortable quiet punctuated by laughter and conversation, by the easy communication of 2 people who had saved each other in the darkness and found their way back to the light together. Emma still missed her parents every day, but the pain had become bearable, integrated into who she was rather than something that defined her completely. And when the memories threatened to steal her voice again, she remembered the lesson she had learned in that mine shaft, that love was worth more than pain, that courage meant speaking even when words were hard, and that sometimes you had to descend into darkness to find your way back to the light.